Boosie Badazz looks to be heading straight back to prison, and this time, potentially for the rest of his life, after a misconduct allegation that has shaken the hip-hop world to its core and put everything he has ever built directly in the crosshairs. We are talking about a man who just dodged a federal prison sentence by the skin of his teeth in January of 2026, who walked out of a San Diego courtroom barely 2 months ago, thinking his legal troubles were finally behind him, and who is now staring down an allegation that, if it ever reaches a courtroom in Louisiana, carries a mandatory sentence of life without parole. No exceptions, no negotiations, life. And it all started with a woman whose face you never see, a woman with a filter over her camera, and a story she says she has been carrying for decades. That video, posted around March 18th, 2026, is what started all of this. And before we go any further, the record needs to be stated plainly. As of the time this video was produced, no charges have been filed, no arrest has been made, and no conviction has been entered against Boosie Badazz in connection with this allegation. Boosie has denied everything, aggressively, publicly, and on camera, and announced his legal team is filing a defamation lawsuit. His response is coming. But the accusation came first. So let's talk about exactly what this woman said. The video surfaced around March 18th, 2026 and detonated across Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and Threads within hours. The woman, unidentified in every public report and news outlet covering the story, spoke calmly, deliberately, and with a level of recalled detail that disturbed virtually everyone who watched. The account was deeply disturbing. Reaction videos were flooding the platform before the original had even finished its first lap around the algorithm. Gossip pages with hundreds of thousands of followers were reposting it before the day was out. Now the internet, as it always does, immediately split. Some pointed to what they saw as inconsistencies. A 5-year-old, they argued, would not typically use the word midnight, would not reconstruct a scene with that kind of cinematic precision. Others countered with what trauma research has consistently documented, that childhood abuse has a complicated relationship with memory, and that the vivid recall of specific sensory details is actually one of the recognized hallmarks of traumatic memory encoding, not a red flag against it. Both arguments ran simultaneously, loudly, and without resolution. There is no police report publicly confirmed, no official law enforcement investigation reported, and no evidence has been presented in any court or verified by any authority as of this video's production. What exists is the accusation, the video, and a social media universe that could not look away. To understand exactly why this accusation landed with the specific force that it did, why it did not simply get dismissed as another viral claim against another celebrity, you have to understand what Boosie Badazz was already carrying when this video dropped. Because this did not land on a man with a clean slate, not even close. Boosie Badazz has been accumulating legal trouble since the early 2000s. Multiple arrests for drug possession and distribution, an indictment in 2010 for first-degree murder, a charge he was acquitted of in 2012 after a full jury trial, an 8-year prison sentence in 2011 after pleading guilty to conspiring to smuggle marijuana into Louisiana state prisons, of which he served roughly 5 years before an early release in March 2014. And then, years later, in May of 2023, an arrest in San Diego during a traffic stop, where police found 2 loaded handguns on a convicted felon. That gun case moved slowly through the system. It was dismissed, refiled, appealed, and reversed. In August of 2025, Boosie pleaded guilty to 1 count of felon in possession of a firearm. Federal prosecutors pushed for 2 years in prison. His defense pushed for probation. In January 2026, a federal judge in San Diego sentenced him to time served, no additional prison time, along with 3 years of supervised release, 300 hours of community service, and a $50,000 fine. He walked out of that courtroom believing the worst chapter of his recent legal history had finally been written. 2 months. That is how long it took. 2 months between walking out of a federal courtroom with his freedom intact and a woman posting a video on social media that would dwarf every previous legal battle he had ever faced in terms of sheer reputational damage and potential consequence. By the time Boosie Badazz found out the video was circulating, it had already reached hundreds of thousands of people across every major platform. His name was trending, his comments were flooded, and a man who had survived a murder indictment, cancer, and federal gun charges was now confronting an allegation that, under Louisiana law alone, carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison without parole if ever charged and convicted. He has been celebrated for over 2 decades as one of the most authentic and resilient voices in Southern hip-hop. 13 studio albums, 44 mixtapes, a career that outlasted prison and illness, and more controversy than most artists see in a lifetime. He is the father of 9 children from multiple relationships. And fatherhood is not just something Boosie mentions in interviews. It is the cornerstone of his entire public identity. The devoted dad, the provider, the man who made it out of Baton Rouge and brought his kids up with him. That image, that identity, was now under siege in the most direct and devastating way imaginable. And what Boosie chose to do in response to that siege, that is where this story gets genuinely extraordinary. And not in a good way. There is a version of events in which Boosie Badazz, upon hearing that a woman had gone viral on social media accusing him of an unspeakable act, consults with his legal team, issues a brief, measured, carefully worded denial, and then lets the process play out quietly while his attorneys do what attorneys are paid to do. That version of events did not happen, not even slightly. What actually happened is that Boosie Badazz went on Instagram Live, and he said things, publicly, on camera, in front of hundreds of thousands of people, that have since become almost as viral as the original accusation. And the things he said were not things that anyone on his team, if his team was paying attention, would have allowed him to say. Because some of what Boosie said in those IG Live sessions did not make him look like a wrongly accused man defending his innocence. Some of what he said made him look like something considerably darker. Let's start with what the source reported as Boosie's initial response. And to be fair, this part is at least defensible. Boosie went live almost immediately after the video began circulating, and it made clear that he was categorically denying every single aspect of the allegation. He called the accusation fake. He called it the worst thing you can say about a man. He said he had just left his lawyer's office, and that defamation paperwork was already being prepared. He offered money, $1,000, to anyone who could provide him with the woman's real name. And he announced that he wanted her address, her family members' names, her grandparents' information, and anything else anyone could give him. He escalated from there. He said that whoever had paid the woman to make the video, because his theory was that someone had orchestrated this, that this was a targeted hit on his reputation, was, in his words, done. He threatened to sue every blog and media outlet that reposted the accusation, sending cease and desist letters across the internet. He described himself as a man who had money, who had lawyers, and who was ready to go to war against anyone and everyone involved. And again, in the very narrow sense of man publicly denying false accusation, some of that is relatively standard. But Boosie did not stop there. Because what came next, in a second wave of IG Live footage that got clipped and shared just as widely as everything else, was Boosie talking about the woman's children. He talked about her children at length. He talked about having pictures of her kids. He talked about how the kids were, in his own words, kind of cute. He said that because he was going to be labeled with the worst accusation imaginable for the rest of his life, her children were not off limits. He said that because his children would one day scroll on Instagram and see this, nobody was off limits. He announced explicitly and on camera that he was going to post her kids online. He said he was going to defect their faces. He said it was never leaving the internet. And then, and this is the moment that truly broke the internet in a second, completely separate wave, he talked about the fact that the woman had reportedly broken her own baby's ribs. He brought that up in the context of his argument that she was a bad mother, an unstable person, someone whose credibility should be questioned. But the way he talked about it, the way he said She broke her baby ribs, bro. The way he circled back to it, the way he connected it to his plan to get the kids too, struck a nerve with a massive portion of the people watching. Because a man who was already facing these kinds of allegations involving a child, now talking in graphic detail about his plans involving his accuser's children, is a very specific and very uncomfortable combination of things. Now, to complete the picture and to be fair to the full record here, Boosie did later post a follow-up update in which he sounded considerably calmer. He said he was in a better space. He said his attorney had spoken to the woman's family members, including her grandmother, and that those family members had told his team that she had been obsessed with Boosie since childhood, that she had mental problems, and that they had never seen him before in their lives. He said the family was ready to come to court and testify on his behalf. He said a private investigator was now involved in what he described as an additional investigation into who had allegedly put the woman up to making the video. But the damage, as Boosie himself had prophetically said in one of those same IG live sessions, was already done. Because once it's on social media, it never leaves. He said that he said it himself on camera, that once it is on social media, it never leaves, that this label would follow him permanently. And that is true. That is absolutely, devastatingly true. And so the question that the internet immediately began asking was a pointed one. If you already know that social media never forgets, why did you get on Instagram Live and threaten to post a woman's children? Why did you say you were going to ruin her life and her kid's life? Why did you talk about those kids being cute? Why did you give the story more ammunition when the story already had plenty? The answer, depending on who you ask, reveals something fundamental about who Boosie Badazz is as a person. His supporters will tell you this is a man in pain, a man who has worked his whole life to build a name and a legacy, who has survived prison and cancer and a murder indictment, who prides himself above all else on being a present, loving father, and who snapped under the unbearable weight of being accused of the one thing he holds most sacred, being violated. They will argue that you cannot judge a man's reaction to the worst moment of his life through a lens of calm, measured rationality. That rage, when it is honest, looks exactly like what Boosie showed. His critics will tell you something very different. They will tell you that a man who immediately pivots to threatening children when cornered, who announces on a live broadcast that he has pictures of his accuser's kids and that they look kind of cute, is showing you exactly, precisely, and unmistakably who he is. That his instinct in a crisis rooted in allegations of abuse involving a child was to turn his gaze toward a child. And the uncomfortable truth that sits at the intersection of both of those readings is this: Boosie Badazz has a documented history of making statements about children, specifically about children and sexuality, that had already put him on very thin ice long before this woman ever posted her video. Here is the thing about a story like this. The thing that separates an accusation that the internet processes and moves on from versus an accusation that completely breaks something open and refuses to let it close. Context. Context is the difference between a viral moment and a cultural reckoning. And the reason the misconduct allegation against Boosie Badazz did not get processed and filed away the way some controversial stories get filed away. The reason it hit differently, the reason the comment sections and the group chats and the reaction channels could not stop circling back to it, is that this allegation did not drop into a vacuum. It dropped into 20 years of documented behavior that a huge portion of the internet had already been deeply uncomfortable with. And when that context came rushing back all at once, the picture it painted was not a comfortable one. Let's go back to 2017. Boosie Badazz posted publicly on social media, in his own words, with his own name attached, that he had arranged for an adult woman to perform an inappropriate act involving his then 14-year-old son, Tootie Raw, as a birthday gift. He said it publicly, on the record. The backlash was severe. He walked it back. But the words existed. They were screenshotted. They were archived. They never left. Then came 2020. He posted a video, which he later deleted, but which had already been clipped and saved and spread. in which he spoke approvingly about having paid for adult encounters for his 12 and 13-year-old son and nephew, and described allowing those minors access to adult content. His stated justification was that it was better than what he described as queer content in children's programming. This was not a rumor. This was not a paraphrase. This was Boosie Badazz, on camera, describing in his own words the deliberate, inappropriate exposure of children in his care, and defending it as good parenting. The internet erupted. And then, because the internet moves fast and Boosie always gave it something new to react to, it eventually moved on. But it did not forget. It never actually forgot. That same year, Boosie trained his attention on Dwayne Wade's then 12-year-old transgender daughter, Zaya, and made a series of comments about her body and her identity that drew condemnation from across the entertainment world, including a direct public response from Gabrielle Union. He was asked to leave a Planet Fitness over it. The story ran for a week. Then the news cycle turned, and Boosie kept going, because Boosie always kept going. In 2021, he aimed a homophobic tirade directly at Lil Nas X and publicly called on him to take his own life. He framed it, as he always frames his most inflammatory moments, as simply telling the truth, being real, refusing to be silenced. His core audience largely nodded along. The rest of the world was by this point running out of words to describe what they were watching. And just this year, on top of the federal gun conviction, on top of the misconduct allegation, on top of everything else, the Louisiana Attorney General's office opened a false advertising investigation into Boosie's 2025 Boosie Bash Music Festival. The allegation that he used the name and image of Caleb Wilson, a deceased Southern University student and hazing victim, on promotional materials without his family's knowledge or permission, connecting it to a claimed memorial scholarship that the family says they never authorized. A motion to compel was filed after Boosie allegedly ignored the AG's inquiries entirely. As of this video's production, that investigation is still open. This is the full picture, not just a single allegation from a woman with a filter on her camera, but a decades-long, thoroughly documented pattern of behavior involving children, inappropriate conduct, public aggression, and a man who has consistently responded to every criticism, every investigation, and every allegation with one singular playbook: deny, attack, escalate, and claim persecution. Because that is exactly what he is doing right now. Even in the moments where Boosie sounds more composed, where the private investigator is working and the family members are ready to testify and the defamation lawsuit is being prepared, the underlying strategy has never changed. It is the same strategy it has always been. Build a wall of noise, make the story about everyone except himself. He has framed the accuser as a psychotic fan. He has framed the blogs and media outlets as co-conspirators deserving of lawsuits. He has sent or threatened cease and desist letters across the internet. He is running simultaneously a legal offensive and a public relations war. And his bet, as it has always been his bet, is that if you flood the zone with enough counterattack, the original story eventually loses its oxygen. It has worked for him before, many times. The question that nobody can answer yet is whether it is going to work this time. Now let's talk about what the law actually says, because this is the part that strips away all the noise and all the strategy and all the IG live footage and gets down to what is actually at stake if this ever moves from a viral video into a courtroom. Under Louisiana Revised Statute 1442, which covers the most serious category of criminal misconduct against a minor, the abuse of a child under 13 years old carries a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment at hard labor without the benefit of parole, probation, or suspension of sentence. Not a guideline, not a starting point that a good defense attorney can negotiate down. A mandatory floor, life without parole. And Louisiana has no statute of limitations on this category of offense involving a child, meaning the passage of time offers zero protection. If the accuser walks into a police station tomorrow or next year or 5 years from now, the case cannot be dismissed on the grounds of when it allegedly happened. On top of that sentence would come mandatory lifetime placement on the offender registry. restrictions on residence, on travel, on who he is permitted to be near, including, potentially, his own 9 children. The financial devastation of frozen royalties, canceled tours, and industry blacklisting on a scale that makes his previous legal troubles look minor. We have watched this exact sequence play out in recent memory, and the most direct comparison, the one that sits in the back of every hip-hop fan's mind when they watch this story unfold, is R. Kelly. A man Boosie himself defended publicly for years, a man whose career also survived decade after decade of allegations, right up until the moment it didn't survive at all. The irony of Boosie Badazz now occupying a position structurally identical to the one he once defended R. Kelly from is not lost on anyone paying attention. His legacy, up to this point, was built on survival. 13 studio albums, 44 mixtapes, a murder acquittal, a cancer diagnosis that he came back from, a prison sentence he outlasted. Younger artists like Kodak Black named styles after him. He built his own label, raised his own children, stayed independent, and never stopped releasing music. By any honest accounting, he had earned his place in the Southern hip-hop canon. That is real. That happened. And it is all now sitting directly in the shadow of everything we have laid out across these 3 parts. Because legacy, in this era, is not a protected asset. It can be amended. It can be revised. It can be dismantled completely. Not by rivals, not by critics, but by the weight of a single video from an unidentified woman with a filter on her face and a story she says she has been carrying since she was 5 years old. Boosie Badazz insists that story is a lie. He says his team is building the case to prove it. He says the accuser's own family will stand up in court and say he was never there. He said that himself, in his own voice, on camera. And he was right. More right than he perhaps intended to be in that moment of fury. Because this is not leaving. The video is not leaving. The accusation is not leaving. The clips of him talking about her children are not leaving. The pattern of statements from 2017 and 2020 and every year in between, those are not leaving either. Boosie Badazz, as of this moment in March of 2026, is a man at war on every front simultaneously: legal, reputational, personal,